Welcome everyone to our webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today's Thursday, September 17th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part 3. Last week we presented part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. Today we'll be looking at the Twin Towers and extreme heat, which will be looking at the evidence of very high temperature and incendiary chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these two skyscrapers. First, though, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. Just let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. You submit them in the questions and information form, which is online at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see the box right there. I'll also be looking at our Facebook broadcast of this webinar and the YouTube broadcast for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard is presenting today. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Oh, thank you, Andy. And of course, Andy's the host of our wonderful 9/11 Freefall radio station, where Andy interviews every week fascinating guests related to the destruction of these towers and sometimes beyond. First, let me introduce you to some of the work that I've done so that you know something about me. I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before we're launching full-time onto this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. And for those of you who missed our recent 9/11 conference, which happened on Friday 9/11, Saturday 9/12, and Sunday 9/13, we had an incredible conference. So visit our website, which is ae911truth.org, and watch it all for free. We had incredible guests there, including James Corbett, John Whitehead, Daniela Ganzer, and all together on one platform for the first time ever, Stephen Jones, David Ray Griffin, Niels Harrod. I'll tell you more about all of those guys coming up. But I want you to make sure you don't miss the opportunity to see that incredible and historic online conference delivered right here from the San Francisco Bay Area at AE 9/11 Truth, where we use the scientific method. What is it? We have a question. How did the towers come down? We do background research, make observations, construct a hypothesis. That's our best hypothesis as to how the towers came down. Maybe jet planes brought them down. We lay out all of the rational hypotheses that make sense. Fires might have brought the towers down, right? According to the official story, or explosions. Explosions were the dominant story on the day of 9/11 and the day after. And something happened to that story, but 36 reporters were reporting that that was the reason the towers came down, because that was what the evidence showed. And that's what we showed last week in this 3-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. Today, we'll be looking at the evidence of extreme heat and incendiaries in a controlled demolition. All the hypotheses are laid out without respect to our personal financial or political affiliations or obligations that might sway our objective opinion in the matter as to whether something was brought down by fire or controlled demolition. It's a very controversial issue, as we all know. So we make predictions based on these rational hypotheses. We test them with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the evidence in an open, transparent manner, so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. We don't hide our computer input data, as NIST has done, from the public and from peer review, as they have done, and gave us excuses like it might jeopardize public safety if we were to release this information. It's the architects and engineers who design these buildings who are tasked with ensuring the public safety. That's why we have to give this information out. So that's just one example of NIST not following the scientific method in their analysis. So we are going to point out several. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, as we'll find NIST's was not, we go back, construct a new hypothesis, and so forth. That's what we'll be doing today until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence and so forth. And so let's look at some of the forces that do destroy buildings as part of our background research. Fire is certainly a dangerous element in buildings. It's an organic process. It moves through the building every 20 minutes or so, burning out one area, moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. Even NIST admits that such fires in the World Trade Center didn't persist at any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. That's all the fuel there is in our modern skyscrapers. But we've never lost a skyscraper due to collapse, due to fire, as we'll see until 9/11, when we're said to have lost not 2, but 3 fire-protected steel frame skyscrapers. But in a wood frame building, we might expect the building to fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through the thousands of tons of structure beneath, which is cold hard and intact, supporting that structure for the life of the building. But in a wood frame building, there's laws of entropy, increasing chaos. We might expect the building to fall in stages and then finally fall over. What about a steel frame building? Well, the largest test of its kind was done in Cardington, UK, 1995, and they built an 8-story building out of steel. Some of it was fireproofed, and some of it, as you see here, was not fireproofed. Jonathan Barnett narrates his thoughts about this. He's one of the FEMA authors, whom we'll look at some more in terms of his opinions that were offered at the time. But they put incredible fuel loads, as you see in this building, unbelievable amounts of fuel in the building. They set it on fire, and let's see what happens.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that is collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, where he's referring, of course, to 9/11, where we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapsed by fire. The results of this study, it's an inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. So even where we don't have fireproofing, we have some warpage, as you can see in the steel, but the connections are all safe. They're stable. They don't release. And we looked last week at the actual computer model of NIST, in which the whole building began to fall apart piece by piece at a rate of 400 structural steel connections, failing every second. It makes no sense given what we see here in these studies. So with the collapses that are caused by nature, in this case, earthquakes, we have a building that'll fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through its own structure. We have a building that's certainly damaged, but we see and recognize it as a building. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. We don't have the concrete turning to a powder, for instance, as we'll see, or as we saw last week in the World Trade Center. We have witnesses with these buildings that were blown up. So these witnesses see flashes of light. They hear sounds of explosions. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized building materials, and pyroclastic-like because the incredible heat that's expanding at an amazing rate in these cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the gases from the intense chemical reactions of the explosions. So if we have these features, we know we have explosions. Now, these features were a part of the official story on day one, but something happened to that story as the week progressed and the national media began to take over the coverage of the story. So we have explosions can be harnessed quite effectively to bring buildings down, like you see in the series of controlled demolitions, like the old hotels in Las Vegas, for instance, where they set thousands of shaped cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and then set them off in a very precise order, usually from the bottom to the top, but they can do that any way that they want, resulting in a set of features that are known as the features of controlled demolition. What are some of those features? Well, let's look at them. We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but again, not always. We have a straight down symmetrical collapse, typically, not always though, into the building's own footprint. That's feature number 2. That's because column supports are removed all at once, typically, or synchronistically timed, and in a pattern. And it results in feature number 4, a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure below. It's been removed. And of course, that results in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. So there's limited damage to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. And there's patterned explosions and flashes of light seen and heard by witnesses. We have broken up concrete floors, often into removable size pieces with the explosives. We don't have to go back into a pile of concrete floors and jackhammer them up manually. No, let the explosives do that work. And so we have explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are isolated explosive ejections called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. And of course, we have left behind chemical evidence of explosive devices. If we have these features, we know we have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically and with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance, and never in a high rise. In fact, let's look at that. There's a whole series of much hotter, larger, and longer lasting fires in these buildings. Let's take a look at them.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17th, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18th, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9th, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, in fact, none of them did. Not even this one. This mid-rise office building inside of the World Trade Center, Building 5, fully engulfed in fire. And here it is afterward. No collapse. And no collapses in these skyscrapers that are fully engulfed after 9/11 happened in 2001. No collapse on these either. And yet these few small scattered fires diminished at the time of the collapse in the World Trade Center, indicated by the thick black smoke that these are oxygen-starved and cooler fires. So why haven't we lost a skyscraper? Well, there are several reasons. One is that steel conducts that heat away from its source. So it never really gets, or rarely, to 1200 degrees at which steel can begin to bend, 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. So we don't want that to ever happen. So we also put cementitious fireproofing in these buildings, 3 hours on the columns and 2-hour fire protection on the beams. That's about 4 to 6 times more fire protection than is needed, because remember, there's only enough fuel in an office a skyscraper to burn for about 20 or 30 minutes in a given area. So this is plenty of conservative design for fireproofing. And we build the buildings out of non-flammable materials. We also keep the tenants from bringing in flammable materials to a large extent, except desks and chairs and paper. But that's all minimal and highly regulated. We also, to keep fire from ever becoming a problem, put in fire sprinklers. And so those were compromised in the case of the Twin Towers, as we're told, by the impact of the airplanes on the fire sprinkler mains. So with government additional circumstantial corroborating information like government documentation, foreknowledge of the destruction, experts agreeing, yeah, that was a controlled demolition, video documentation, all that can be proof of controlled demolition. A model of proof that we're now going to apply to the Twin Towers. And so we saw last week in this 3-part series, in part 2, we saw that there was a sudden onset of destruction. We saw that it didn't hesitate and as it was impacting the section of building below. No, it was a smooth, sudden descent. We saw that there were patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses prior to the building's collapse altogether. And then flashes of light, of course, as well. And then that we saw a straight down or near straight down symmetrical progression of the destruction down all 4 faces of the building, even though we have asymmetrical damage from the fires, the jet plane impacts up above. We saw ejections of building materials at the lower floors, 20, 40, even 60 stories down below what we're told is a gravitational collapse going on up above. We saw the near free fall acceleration, almost as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, even though there's incredible quantities of steel particularly on the exterior face of this structure, and the 47 massive core columns on the inside as well. We saw the total shattering of those columns and beams, one from another, all the way down, top to bottom, into its individual structural segments. We saw the lateral ejection of structural steel sections weighing 4 to 8 tons, laterally ejected 80 miles an hour, clocked by physicists out. Remember, gravity works down. So here we are hurling these structural steel sections 600 feet in every direction. There's enough energy there to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. We saw the pulverization of concrete, the complete pulverization of 90,000 tons of concrete to a fine ash that's distributed outside the footprint, in fact, in a 3 square mile area in a blanket 3 inches thick of this ash, powdered concrete mostly. So we then saw that the steel wasn't available to crush the building because the steel was ejected well outside the footprint. And there's no concrete pancakes at the bottom of these floors of either tower. They're outside the footprint. So that's 2/3 the weight of the building that's not even available to crush the building. This is all direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Today, we're moving on with feature 8, pyroclastic-like clouds. We start with National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for Fire and Explosion Investigation, which says, look for thermal effects. Well, including large amount of gas and the large amount of heat released of chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, which we see racing away 35 miles an hour in every direction during and after the destruction of these buildings. Some incredible source of heat responsible for these gases, which are expanding 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. And we're led to believe that these few small and scattered fires in these buildings at the time of the collapse, which were quite diminished, are responsible for all of that heat. No, it's something else, something on the order of this, several orders of magnitude hotter. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, evidence of extreme heat in the World Trade Center. Let's start with Massimo Mazzucco's 9/11 New Pearl Harbor. Oops. That one again for you.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out, still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was the core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it was just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
you would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out and ironworkers with their boots literally melted, and then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60-foot-long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by, and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away.
But not only that, the structural engineers, including David Scott of Arup Associates, says the red-hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. It was dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Saw pools of literally molten steel at the World Trade Center, says the president of the cleanup company, Tully Construction. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams, ranging from molten metal, which was still red-hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains, streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down, metal dripping from a beam, says this firefighter. Molten steel beams. The end of the beam would be dripping with molten steel. And the president of another cleanup company, Controlled Demolition Inc., Mark Loiseau, says molten steel was encountered during the excavation of debris. There are videotape and photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. A river of steel flowing, says who? The World Trade Center structural engineer himself, Leslie Robertson, and his associate Richard Garlock. The debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running, and molten metal pouring from the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. This says, oh, this must be molten aluminum from the jet plane. No, molten aluminum does not glow bright yellow and white and yellow and white hot. It's silvery in daylight conditions. Not like this material pouring out of the debris held in the jaws of this crab claw excavator. And molten concrete, I didn't even know concrete could melt. It melts at 3,200 degrees. In the Police Museum in Manhattan today, you can see this handgun with molten concrete wrapped around it. Fire temperatures so intense that concrete melted like lava around everything in its path. The FEMA author Jonathan Barnett says steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Well, what can account for that? It takes 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit to melt or evaporate steel, and 2,800 degrees to begin to melt it. Where are these temperatures coming from? I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center, says this structural engineer who had an access through the National Science Foundation grant to study the steel. He says, if you remember the Salvador Dali paintings and clocks that are kind of melted, it's kind of like that. It can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000 degrees. Well, actually hotter than that. Let's take a look.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at Ground Zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact,
where is thousands of degrees coming from? Well, let's look at FEMA's original report that came out in May of 2002, in which they document a metallurgical examination of the steel in their Appendix C. What do they say? It thinned to almost razor sharpness, a 1-inch column reduced to 1/2-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting, liquid iron, that's molten iron, that's 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit minimum. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel, but no clear explanation of the source of the sulfur has been identified. They have no idea how this hot sulfur corrosion attack with liquid molten iron even happened, but we're going to learn how it might have happened. It was deemed perhaps the greatest mystery uncovered in the investigation, says the New York Times, and yet it's completely ignored by NIST, omitted in their final report. And yet the presence of sulfur is clearly indicated. What does NIST say about the sulfur? In a very frequently asked question published years later, they speculate sulfur is present in gypsum wallboard. That was prevalent in the interior petitions. Wait a minute. Gypsum wallboard has calcium sulfate, but that's bonded. It's inert. It doesn't attack steel, particularly in the last 100 years where it's been used to protect steel from fire. It's never turned around and attacked it. So the arbiter of competing hypotheses is experiment. Let's get the hottest office fire we can here, simulate it, and put gypsum wallboard next to the steel and see if it attacks it. Did it? Nope, clean as a whistle. Yet the smell of that sulfur permeated the World Trade Center. It burned, the smell of sulfur, says Jonathan Field of the Feel Good Foundation, an iron worker injured on the site. And let's listen to the response from NIST now to all of this phenomena of extreme temperatures.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled out the big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Wow. And yet, here's Jonathan Gross on the pile, cutting off the very piece of steel that was sent to FEMA's limited metallurgical examination team, and finding that piece of World Trade Center 7 steel, the very same piece. His shadow is all over the evidence. So what could be responsible for these incredible temperatures? Hydrocarbons, meaning buildings and even jet fuel, only produce 600 to 1400 degree temperatures Fahrenheit. In fact, that's what the ME Petroleum, one of the main manufacturers of jet fuel, says. Burning in open air, 600 degrees maximum. Jet fuel, it's basically kerosene. But steel had definitely melted. So what's responsible for this? You can tell by the color of molten iron and steel what its temperature is. Here we're exceeding 2500 degrees. That's just the physics of molten materials like that. So what caused it to melt? Well, NIST speculates in, again, very frequently asked questions published years later on their website. Any molten steel in the wreckage is more likely due to the high temperature resulting from the long exposure to combustion within the pile. rather than short exposure to fires or explosions while the buildings were standing. Really, there's a law, conservation of energy in a closed system such as pulverized concrete powder covering fires that are burning in the basements of the World Trade Center. The amount of energy is fixed. You can't create any more energy inside the system. In other words, the fire can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that it's burning. You can only convert that energy you have from one form to another. So what about feature 10? What's responsible for all this heat? Could thermite have produced all that molten material? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, then it would explain the presence of iron, elemental iron. We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years. You know, this is not steel, this is elemental iron. It would also explain the presence of the incredible heat, thermite producing 4,000 degree temperatures Fahrenheit. And it would also explain the presence of sulfur, which is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. Well, the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST says, well, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Okay. They finally admit, a year later, they didn't test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't test for. But others did, and it wasn't that difficult to find. Stephen Jones, nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University, finally uncovers what's going on here. He says, well, if thermite were used, it'd produce a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower, like the first responders saw in the basements. He says also a whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash, like we see rising off the material pouring out of the South Tower, like we see trailing these structural steel sections hurled out of the Twin Towers, freely flying. Steel is not flammable. What in the official narrative can possibly explain the ends of these structural steel sections trailing thick white smoke clouds? Almost like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea with freely flying red-hot molten materials trailing thick white smoke clouds. The geometry of fireworks. And both tower destruction of both towers is the same, as you see. They're nearly identical.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames.
The steel is on fire? Explain that. Well, what would the signature of thermite be like? It would leave behind unique chemical evidence, says Dr. Jones. Common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon. More unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. These elements in the periodic table of the elements. Well, somebody sent Dr. Jones a chunk because they heard about some of the work he was doing of this meteorite, they called them, these fused molten metal. And he does electron microprobe data, finding it's predominantly iron. So he can rule out molten aluminum from the jet planes. It has abundant manganese, so he can rule out structural steel as a major component. Well, it has aluminum, sulfur, potassium. So this is the residue of thermite. Even more assuring of that conclusion, the presence of manganese and fluorine in abundance. Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in special thermite charges called sol gels. So these are often present in the residue and are part of the thermite fingerprint. There's no doubt in his mind. But sol gels, in other words, super thermite, as documented by Lawrence Livermore Lab, who did work on this, would have another residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane. Well, the EPA analysis of the dust finds one molecule at present at levels that dwarfed all others. 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done, says Eric Schwartz of the EPA. He speculates that it might be from computers because there's plastics there, but they've never observed it in any other sampling they've ever done. Well, the Peace Park in Manitoba, Canada, sculptor sent a piece of slag to Stephen Jones as well. He does X-ray fluorescence shows what? Iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese. Again, with XEDS analysis proving the same. This is the signature of thermite. Why is the signature of thermite found on all of these residues from the structural steel following 9/11? Well, you can do backyard thermite or thermate experiments, as John Cole, civil engineer, did. Here's the results.
Web was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Wait, where have we seen this before? Oh, yeah. In the steel documented in Appendix C of the metallurgical examination of the World Trade Center steel. Thinned to almost razor sharpness. Well, there are much more sophisticated shaped cutter charges invented prior to 9/11. They eject molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds. It's actually much more effective than high energy shaped cutter charges with high energy explosives like C4 or RDX. But they're very expensive. And there are devices whose casings themselves are made of consumable consolidated thermite. Nothing left in the rubble except pools of molten iron, which is found all over the place by so many. What else was found in the fine powder across lower Manhattan in a 3 square mile area in a blanket 3 inches thick of all this concrete powder? Well, the U.S. Geological Survey in 2005 documents the contents of the dust, including about 4 tons of molten iron microspheres, about the diameter of a human hair, up to a 1/16 of an inch. Up to 6% of some of these samples are composed of these previously molten iron microspheres, amounting to up to about 4 tons by extrapolation. It's about 150 times more iron than in background office dust, which is not even spherical, as you see here. So R.J. Lee Group, an independent environmental engineering firm, confirms the presence of these iron spheres. They're very, very curious about them. They document that they're formed during the event, not before by the welders putting up the building, not after by the iron workers taking the pieces apart, but during the event. There's so many of them that they're used as a signature component to determine what is and what is not World Trade Center dust. Well, where would they come from? Well, here's a controlled experiment of a small quantity of thermite. Let's see what happens here. Slowing that down halfway, we see thousands of what look like sparks, but they're liquid molten iron, and they fall as spheres into the pan because aerosolized liquid forms itself into spheres by surface tension. That's just what it does. And then it solidifies. And maybe before it cools, could that be what's responsible for the toasting of the tops of these cars around the World Trade Center in this extremely high heat event? Okay, so what else do we find in the World Trade Center? Well, this is interesting. We're going to reset our PowerPoint. Hold on one second. There. A blanket of dust, 3 inches thick. Well, several samples, 7 of them, independently collected and sent to a team of international scientists, 8 of them, led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen, including samples from the dust in this apartment of Jeanette McKinley. Her windows blew in from the incredible explosive force of the South Tower across the street and filled her apartment. She was an artist. She used this material to aid in her traumatic her recovery from the traumatic incident. She paid for that decision with her life. She died of cancer, but not before giving a set of samples to Stephen Jones, one of these 4 samples. They all contain these red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. They're obviously fluid applied. And the largest of them is about 1/16 of an inch long. They look like paint, but they're attracted to a magnet. So it's not paint. It has a high iron content. They get real curious. They do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy of the red layer, finding what? The ingredients of thermite, unignited thermite, iron and aluminum with silicon, oxygen, and carbon. That comes into play. Very interesting in a moment. The red layer, they get real curious, zoom in 50,000 times, and they find what? Iron oxide rhomboidal-shaped crystals at a nanoscale, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair, these individual particles. And same with the aluminum platelets. They're set in a matrix with which is organic material, oxygen, silica, carbon. Organic material is used in TNT to produce the loud the concussive force that knocks things over with high energy explosives. Okay, so they're really curious now. They put it in a heater because that's what the Lawrence Livermore lab did with this material, which was called super thermite. And at 758 degrees Fahrenheit, they ignite, producing much more energy. And so it's active thermitic material here, providing an exothermic reaction. And the same thing happens with all 4 samples, indicating, no, this is not paint. This is something very, very sophisticated. And what happens when they emit, when they ignite in this exothermic reaction. They produce molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres discovered in the dust by the U.S. Geological Survey, R.J. Lee, and others. So we know where those molten iron microspheres came from. They came from those red-gray chips, as if we didn't know. They're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as we see here and here. So you see, this is an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable experimental data that could put a lot of people away, the real perpetrators, because this is an extremely sophisticated process. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. And it's all documented in a peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It's active, unreacted thermitic material, incorporating nanotechnology, a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive. This is direct evidence of destruction with explosives, and particularly incendiaries today. It's not evidence of destruction by fire. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. Especially these fires, diminished at the time of the collapse, which is proved by the videos of the thermal imaging cameras showing temperatures hardly over 200 or 300 degrees Fahrenheit. With experts agreeing, like 100 structural engineers demanding a new investigation, signed on to the petition along with the other 3,200 architects and engineers. Ron Brookman doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable, as claimed by NIST? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents into dust and twisted steel? At Moonyak, the fires are very weak. NIST reports confirm that the steel temperatures were low. World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire or collapse caused by fire. How about the evidence? Surely it was preserved. And easily the three most puzzling structural failures in history. Let's go to this structural engineer, Abulhassan Astani Azal, who had the Science Foundation grant.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, to China for recycling. Yes, indeed, it certainly did. In fact, this is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. Mike Bloomberg, mayor, says, who's an engineer, says just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything. As a justification for the destruction of the evidence, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it did not. And easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures. We have 400 truckloads per day carting this material to where? To be put on barges to sent to China for recycling. 15 cents a pound, way underpriced for the recycling of structural steel. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting so many to conclude in their independent use of the scientific method to determine that it's not jet planes or fires that brought down the Twin Towers, but explosions in a controlled demolition with incendiaries, actually. Explosions, yes, high energy explosions also. We saw that yesterday. Last week in features 1 through 7. This week we looked at incendiary chemical evidence, both of which it's plain to see were used here for the destruction, the direct evidence they are of destruction with explosives. Fire not creating any of these with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence and eyewitness testimony. We have more than 3,000. That's why we have more than 3,300 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. That's why we want you to do something about this. But first, let's find out how you can ask questions. Andy, how do they submit their questions here?
Okay, you submit them in the input form we mentioned earlier. You go to ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education and select the live webinars. The box is right there, and we'll do our best to answer them. But right now, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Well, thank you. And while you're there, everybody, do subscribe to our every week or two, we send out something really important, our bulletins. Get that information, the latest evidence that we have, the latest efforts progress we're making toward getting a real investigation. It's a lot of work. We've been on it for 14 years, and we're making lots of progress, as I'll let you know here. You can get informed on our website. There's all kinds of evidence here, videos, documents. While you're there, sign the petition, support 3,000 architects and engineers. Especially if you are one, but even if you are not, we have 20,000 others supporting them. And donate while you're there. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Your donation is tax deductible. We have a staff of 6 that is working full time to get the word out there, to do things like have the conference that we just completed, September 11, 12, and 13, which you can now find 12 hours of conference on our website, ae911truth.org, or on YouTube for free. Either way, but support us, because we can't do things like this without your support. We take PayPal, we take credit cards, we take checks, we take cash. So support us. It takes a lot of us working together. We have we have 2,000 sustaining supporters who have joined the family of AE911 Truth as a sustaining supporter. Be one of them. For the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you can be one of us. And if you donate $50 or more every month, we put you on our quarterly collaborator conference call, and we listen to your advice, and we talk to you and tell you what's going on every quarter. So join us at that level for sure. And if you can't, volunteer with us. Andy, there's lots of things to do, isn't there?
Absolutely. There's a lot of jobs that people can take on. If you just got a few hours a week to do it, that's all that it takes. And I don't know what the exact quote is, but it's something like most success is from 90%, 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration, something like that. But regardless, even if I can't get the quote right, it doesn't make it it's true. All right, so you just got to do the work, and we have things that you can do. Sometimes you will have ideas or a special skill set as well that you can bring to the table that we haven't even thought of. It happened to me today with a volunteer. So please, if you think you can contribute in any little way and you want to be part of something that is important, I think one of the most important movements in modern U.S. history, then the first step is to go to ae911truth.org. There's a volunteer form right on there. Fill it out. And within a few days, we'll get in touch with you and talk to you and see where you'll best fit. And that's it. That's the first step.
Okay. And there's things you can do on your own. You know, a lot of people work alone. Call for a new investigation. Reach out to your local elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Tell everyone you know. Screen the DVDs. Hand out the brochures at Actions while you're tabling out there. To get the word out. There's thousands of people doing this all across the country, and millions in the 9/11 Truth movement all around the world. Share the brochures one-on-one. They're $10 for a pack of 100 in our website. And in fact, here is one right now. If you, this is our brochure. If you send me an email at contactus@ae911truth.org, put one word on there, street brochure. I guess that's 2 words. I'll send you 100 of them for free. How's that? And the first one that gets time stamped today, send it to me, man. I will get those brochures out in the mail to you, because we're doing everything we can to get the word out. And this includes Leroy Halsey. We hired one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country. The University of Alaska at Fairbanks conducted a 4-year finite element analysis, computer modeling, and they did the work. What did they find with regard to Building 7? That this building did not come down due to normal office fires as documented by NIST. It came down in a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of its columns. Well, what can do that? That is called controlled demolition. That's the only thing that can do that. That's why we sent 75,000 cards to structural engineers all around the country. We mailed them because we have supporters like you who keep us enable us to do things like this. That's why we had a 3-day conference in which Matt Campbell was here to talk about the inquest into his brother's death that he's applying for with help from you. $100,000 almost so far has been raised. We were like almost there. So please continue to support this effort. It's $540 an hour for the best attorney in London. And he's won many cases against the government there. So he's the right guy. And he's completely in agreement with this evidence. It's overwhelming, he says. We have a very good chance. In fact, this is a tailor-made opportunity to get our evidence into the court system outside the US for the first time ever. It's going to be awesome because the other 9/11 family members, particularly in the UK, but all around the world, will eventually join in when this new inquest reveals that, yes, the evidence supplied by AE 9/11 Truth supports the conclusion that these buildings came down by explosive demolition and incendiary demolition. And that's what we talked about on Friday, in addition to the new film we're making on Building 7 with, that's on Saturday, Dylan Avery. And we had Leroy Halsey in person there to talk about the backstory with this investigation. We talked about our request for correction, which is going in to NIST as an appeal because they denied it without giving us any valid reasons why on 8 particular points here that they were vulnerable on. The Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry gave their update on Friday. And then on Saturday, we went to the evidence with Roland Angle talking about the evidence of Building 7, myself, the Twin Towers. And then we had for the historic presence of David Ray Griffin, Niels Harrit, and Stephen Jones, all on the same platform with me. It was an incredible event. You've got to see it on YouTube or on our website, ae911truth.org. And then Big Picture Sunday, Daniela Ganser, John Whitehead, James Corbett, biggies in the 9/11 Truth movement who are pushing for a real investigation. James Corbett, of course, talking about censorship. John Whitehead, the government of wolves, which the increasing police state since 9/11 as a result of 9/11, and then the false flag operations leading to wars of terror, as documented by Daniela Ganser from Switzerland. It's all been incredible. All of this, of course, inspiring 5 New York area fire commissioners to demand a new investigation into the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers. The request for correction involves the column 79 side plate, all in Building 7, the thermal expansion of these beams, the web stiffeners that was omitted by NIST, the cascade of floors that couldn't possibly have happened in the NIST scenario, the seismic evidence which proves these are explosions and not a collapsing building, and the global collapse analysis by NIST which couldn't possibly have happened their way. It had to have been the removal of all the columns in the building, again, within a second of each other, as proven by the University of Alaska. The eyewitness accounts and evidence of explosions that we talked about last week in detail, and of course, the severely eroded steel, all of which evidence points to controlled demolition and forces NIST to completely reverse their collapse initiation theory. And so this is the reason we want you to do what, Andy? What do we want people to do here now?
We want you to get involved. That's the most important thing, because nothing happens in this country unless people take the initiative themselves. Otherwise, you end up with the status quo, which obviously right now is not very good. So this is our effort right now and it is ongoing. You can do it today, you can do it next week, but set up a meeting with your member of Congress. It's very easy. We had an article that actually tells you what to do. I think we need to get that more out into the forefront. But if you need advice on what to do, just write us at congress@ae911truth.org, and I'll tell you what to put in, or you can write your own letter. But the essence of what you're requesting is to get a meeting over the phone with yourself and a representative of your congressman's office and with members of AE 9/11 Truth, Richard included. We're going to be talking about a number of things. We'll talk about the Bobby McIlvaine Act with them. We'll talk about the evidence, of course, and of course about the request for correction, which is still an ongoing issue. But they need to hear from us a lot of times. They can't just hear from us once, because that is just how the nature of our government works. And so you have to get involved. And we could request the appointments ourselves, but we're just a couple of guys who have an office in Berkeley. If we're out of their district, they're not going to be as interested in hearing from us. They want to hear from their constituents, and it's a very easy thing for you to do. It just requires very little effort, and we enjoy doing it as well, and having that back and forth. So please get involved. And of course, it's for the Bobby McIlvaine Act, which we talk about every week on this webinar. This is the path to justice. It's legislation, draft legislation that's been written to force Congress to address all the points that Richard has been making for the past many years about September 11th and the World Trade Center. And you can learn more about that by going to ae911truth.org/justice, and you can get involved right from that page. So please do that little bit of work, and it'll go a long way if everybody does it.
Thank you, Andy. And I'll just tell you where we are with the grand jury investigation. We submitted our evidence. Jeffrey Berman, the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney General, says we'll comply with the law, which requires us to give this to a special grand jury. But we don't have evidence that he's done that, so we sued him. Mandamus action. And the back and forth is going on with that in the court right now. We expect to win, as we do our FBI lawsuit, because they were required to give this evidence to Congress. This evidence being specifically the Nano-thermite paper, which we gave the FBI, and our DVD, which they, with all this evidence on it, giving to them. And Assistant Chief Counterterrorism Michael Heimbach wrote back, said, gosh, this appears to be backed by thorough research and analysis. Well, they didn't give that to Congress when required. All the evidence after the 9/11 Commission report was required to be given to Congress. They failed to do that. We sued them. And that is going back and forth in the court system right now. So we'll have reports for you soon on that. We made an incredible documentary with all this evidence, including 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. I want to give you just a piece before we, a couple of minute piece, in a view into this awesome documentary before we get to your questions here. Here goes.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nano-thermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yes, you can watch this documentary on YouTube. It's free, the 1-hour version, or you can watch the 90-minute version, which I highly recommend. It's in our store at ae911truth.org. Includes also the Meet the Experts bonus DVD with 40 additional extended interviews. Great information for you to be looking at. And then our 50-page booklet created by Ted Walter on our team, Beyond Misinformation, completely pulls the rug from out underneath NIST, who committed fraud in their reports, which is very well documented here, and including the evidence of what really happened. And then our classic lecture on this dynamic presentation, multimedia on this subject, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, 2-hour version free on YouTube, as is the 15-minute documentary narrated by Ed Asner, free on YouTube, just on Building 7. And I'm guessing we might have some questions. Is that true, Andy?
Right. We got one question today, and I just want to share a quick sentiment, not so much a question, from Facebook. And the person wrote, you can tamper with media, public opinion, results, and popularity levels. You can't tamper with physics and science, period. I amen that statement, and I always say that they say everything changed on 9/11, but you know what didn't change is the laws of physics and nature.
Good point.
We should have believed that indirectly. All right, here's the question. It's a long one. It says, in the frequently asked questions to NIST, question 21 asks, why did NIST state that a yellow stream of molten metal seen pouring down the site of WTC-2 was aluminum when molten aluminum is silver in color and not yellow. NIST then says that molten aluminum normally is silver in color. But then using speculation without any demonstration, NIST simply throws out a far-fetched idea on how molten aluminum could look yellow in color instead of silver. And it must have been a far-fetched idea because in the Alan Reese interview with Shyam Sunder, Sunder says the molten material had to be aluminum because the color was not yellow. First, NIST is bending over backwards to say how molten aluminum can easily be a yellow color, but then Shyam Sunder denies that it was yellow color. My question is whether or not this NIST contradiction is part of the evidence for the grand jury to see. And if it isn't, I think it should be. Any comments? I just want to say real quick, that's the Alan Reese interview with Shyam Sunder. I actually covered this on my podcast in 2016. And indeed, Shyam Sunder says that the metal coming out of Tower 2 is silver. When any truther can look that up and see that is clearly not silver. I don't know who he thinks he was lying to, or that 9/11 Truth is going to instantly fact check him. I hope he's a lot wiser now. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I hope so too. They're tripping all over themselves. When you lie, there's no end to the lies because each one has to support the next. And then you get back to where they're giving you contradictory information, contradictory lies that contradict themselves. Each lie contradicts the next one or the one or two before it. I just love telling the truth, Andy, because we only have to tell it once and straightforward, and it's backed up by the facts, the science, the evidence, the eyewitness testimony. It's great. So we don't have to keep changing our story at AE 9/11 Truth. We just have to keep telling the truth. And people just keep having to wake up. You know, molten aluminum is silvery in daylight conditions. Period. Try it yourself. Melt some aluminum and pour it out. It looks like mercury. So in daylight. And it doesn't glow white hot and yellow as we saw from the material pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. Like the first responders saw, flowing like lava down the channel rails. They're just like freaked out. They've never seen anything like this. Because fires only get to be 1,300, 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. NIST, without any evidence at all, claimed the fires were 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. There's not enough fuel up there to create fires that hot. And jet fuel only burns at 600 degrees Fahrenheit, according to its own manufacturer, ME Petroleum, burning in open air. So NIST is struggling. They're between a rock and a hard spot. And the request for correction included much more specific and egregious examples of violation of basic physics. And we could have given them a 60 count request for correction, but it was 100 pages as it was, and most easily provable points of fraud on their part. Easy for us to prove. So, yeah, we could have included it. Yeah, we included it in all of our presentations. But this is a 4-hour presentation cut into 3 sections, which is more digestible for everybody. So we couldn't include all this evidence in the request for correction. But I really appreciate the point made here. And again, I want to beg you to list all of these great questions from our great audience who comes up with these thoughtful questions that really NIST is the one that has to respond. We can simply point out how great these questions are and how they violate NIST's own evidence that they present. Also, they completely contradict it. So that's my thought. Do you have any follow-up thoughts, Andy?
Yeah, and I think we should list them. I think now that the anniversary is over, we should go through them. excuse me, all archived in the inbox here. So it'd be a pretty quick project, I think. The only thing I'll add to that is that, I mean, from my own view, the case is already made, and I can sense this from my interactions with people in government offices and other people in the media. I don't think the issue is making the case any further, although we should and continue to point out these things, as this great questioner has done. The major problem is just institutional and sociological. I think that I think a lot of people who hold positions of power, even if they wanted to do something, don't know how to go about doing it at this point. Now, in my view, there's ways that you can do it. But I haven't had that conversation with them. But I think that's the main issue that we're facing right now, because once you get this evidence in front of them, it's pretty hard to deny, just with what Richard presents already in these webinars. So keep on making these points. They're great to point out. But the real focus is getting past those barriers that we're always facing. That's my personal view.
Yeah, right on. Thank you. Andy, today we looked at part 3, the Twin Towers in extreme heat. And guess what? Last week was part 2. If you missed it, go back and see it, everybody. YouTube is great for this purpose. Just Google 9/11 An Architect's Guide, part 2, the Twin Towers Explosive Destruction. We do this every month, all 3 of these series. We start again in October with part 1, the World Trade Center Building 7. If you didn't know, don't feel bad. Most architects and engineers know nothing about the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history. After the Twin Towers, this building is an extraordinary failure. Wasn't hit by a plane. Yet it dropped 7 hours after the Twin Towers, after witnesses hear explosions, straight down, uniformly, suddenly, symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. And that's at free fall. Acceleration as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. Faster and faster and faster every second. So don't miss that. That's coming up the first Thursday in October at 1 p.m. Until then, it's been our pleasure to be with you, and join us again, and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and do what you can on Facebook to share the evidence here with your friends. Really appreciate that. We'll catch up with you in October. Thanks, everybody. Bye for now.